We are just so excited to have author Jasmine Warga here with us, who wrote Other Words for Home, which I was so excited. This was one of the books that was chosen, and I'm really excited to have her here today and to talk about the book and to talk about her writing. And so I think without further ado, we will go ahead and get started. We will have a question and answer portion at the end of her presentation today. And so if you have other questions, I know we did collect questions when you registered, but if you have other ones, feel free to send them along and we'll see what we can get to at the end. But we will go ahead and get started. So welcome, Jasmine. We're so excited to have you here today.
Thanks, I'm thrilled to be here. So as I was telling Lois before we went live, I have been trying to figure out how to retool my presentation to be something that will work in this new virtual format that we're all adapting to. So I've kind of condensed it down. I'm gonna go ahead and share. Is that good, Lois, to share?
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead and share. And so basically, I thought today to start, before we do the question and answer part, I would walk all of you through how a book becomes a book. Because when I go on school visits and library visits, that is sort of the #1 question that I get asked the most by young people. And so I thought I would do that by sort of taking all of you through the journey of creating Other Words for Home. So how it all started, all the way through to publication. So how does a book get made? So the first thing for a book to exist is an idea, which might seem obvious, but that's another question I get asked all the time by young readers, which is, where do you get your ideas? How do you come up with an idea for a book? How do you know if it's a good idea for a book? And the answer is, I am never sure if it's a good idea. I have lots of ideas and I kind of have to test them out and see if they stick, if they are what I call sticky ideas, which means that once I have it, it stays with me and it nags at me and it doesn't let me go. And if that is the way it is, then I kind of know that I'm onto something and want to give it a try. And so these little weird clip arts are basically saying that lots of my ideas come from observing the world around me. I think that if you are here and you want to be a writer, one of the best things you can do is hone your curiosity. All of my favorite writers are deeply curious people about the world around them, asking questions of like, why is this the way it is? Or what does it mean that this is the way it is? And I think a lot of ideas can be born from that kind of observation and questioning. And so for Other Words for Home, I got the idea, the first kind of spark of an idea in August of 2013. And so a little bit about me, I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, and my father is an immigrant from Jordan. And the Middle Eastern community in Cincinnati is rather small, and our closest family friends were Syrian. And so I grew up with this family, going over to their house all the time for dinner. And so on this particular night, I was going over to dinner at their house, and that wasn't unusual at all. What was a little bit different is at this dinner, I was going to be introduced to lots of members of this family that I had never met before, because they had just come over from Syria because of the growing conflict there. And so think back to August 2013. For me, at least, I didn't know a lot at this time about the conflict in Syria. It wasn't at the point where it was major news, at least in kind of American or Western media. And anyways, what I guess kind of the idea that got the wheels turning in my brain was not really the politics of the situation in Syria, but more the dynamic I was watching between the cousins who had been born here in the US, who had a background like mine, and the cousins who had been born in Syria. And I started thinking, what would it have been like for me if my cousins from Jordan had moved to the United States when I was in 7th and 8th grade? And what would that have been like for me? And how would I have treated them? And how would I have acted? And so that became this idea and became that sticky idea that I was talking about earlier. But the idea had to marinate. And I think letting your ideas marinate happens for two reasons for me. One, like I have been touching on, it lets me know if it's an idea that I'm really committed to, that I'm going to stick with. Because as you'll see as we get further into this, when you pick your idea and you pick your book, it's a long slog, and that's it. But the other thing is, I was working on another book, which often happens. So like I have ideas right now that I'm super excited about, but I can't work on them yet because I'm working on something else. And kind of, I think, again, that the ideas that stay with you while you have to work on another book, that's always a sign that that's kind of a good bet for your next idea. So as the idea marinated, and as I worked on this other book, the Syrian conflict worsened and was covered more and more by the American media as the refugee crisis grew. And I was confused and upset about the response that I was seeing to the refugee crisis, particularly from neighbors and friends. And I was just a little bit baffled about why so many people were having such a negative reaction to these refugees. And I sort of began to realize that so many Americans had terrible misconceptions about the religion of Islam and about the Middle East as a whole. And here I also want to be careful to be clear that not every single refugee from Syria is Muslim. There are lots of Christian and other religions in Syria, but the predominant religion is Muslim. And I feel like a lot of the rhetoric, negative rhetoric around the refugees that I was seeing had a very like Islamophobic flavor to it. So when I talk about that, that's what I mean. And here's a map of the Middle East. I like to show that in all my school visits because I realize a lot of kids don't really even know where Syria is positioned. So can't really point so you can see, but if you can see Jordan, that's the country where my father is from, which borders Syria. And in the story, if you've read the story, Jude is from a town that's on the coast there. You see like where Syria kind of borders Lebanon. So, but it's further north, the town I loosely based where she's from. Anyways, I was thinking a lot about this, about all the misconceptions that Americans have about the Middle East and why they have them and what kind of Western media's portrayal of the Middle East is. So in the book, Jude is one of 6.7 million refugees created by the Syrian Civil War. And the Syrian Civil War has really affected children specifically who have lost family members, friends, their school. A large number of the refugees are children. And so like I said, when I got the initial idea for the book, I've been thinking about writing it from the perspective of a cousin who was born here in America and what her response was to her cousin from Syria coming over, which would be like if I had written the book from Sarah's point of view. And as interested as I am in that narrative, which we can talk about later if there's interest in that, I was feeling inspired to really want to showcase and give agency and humanity to these kids that I felt like were being reduced down to that baffling number of 6.7 million, and also being talked about in these cold clinical terms. And I think that when we are presented with numbers that are this baffling, it's easy to lose sight that every single one of those kids is a person with their own story, with their own dreams, with their own specificities. And one of the strange and beautiful things about storytelling, I think, is that specificity is what can bring alive a universal concept. And so I decided to undertake wanting to write this book from Jude's perspective. The scary and difficult thing about that is I obviously do not have Jude's life experience. I have never been a refugee. I've never been an immigrant. And so I knew I was gonna have to be really careful in my research if I wanted to do justice to Jude's story and tell it in what I wanted it to be an authentic and responsible way. I often think the other problem with refugee narratives is sometimes they focus so much on the pain and the trauma and amping up kind of that journey narrative that they lose sight again of that like humanity and the universalness of being 12, no matter what your situation is or your ethnicity is or your home life is. And I really wanted to bring that alive in June. And so with that in mind, I decided that I would tell this very specific type of refugee story. So as difficult as Jude's journey is, I always love to stress to kids when I get to talk about this book that Jude has a very privileged refugee story and that she already has family in the United States that she can come to. This is not one of the situations where her parents are putting her on an overcrowded boat with just the hopes that it's going to reach shore in another country. And while those stories I think are meaningful and deserve to be told, I knew I wasn't the person who could tell that story, but I felt plugged in enough to the Syrian refugee community in Cincinnati, most of whom had connections to family members to be able to tell the story. And so I conducted lots of interviews with my family friends, and then they put me in contact with other Syrians in the Cincinnati area. And I talked about this, I guess, a little bit already, but I always want to stress that these refugees, all of them, they want the same things that you do. They want a safe home, they want a chance at happiness. And I think that what frustrates me so much is the thing that they are running from is the same thing that they're being called in Western media and being made to seem. And that's a very like frustrating paradox to me. And I wrote Other Words for Home in lots of ways to want to challenge that. So had the first spark of an idea in 2013, but didn't sit down to start writing the actual book, doing the actual writing until the summer of 2016. And that's when I really started writing it in earnest. And while writing it, I was thinking a lot about my own experiences as a kid and the ways that I was made to feel about my Arab heritage and the fact that my family is Muslim and the messaging that I got from Western media. And so while the story is completely fictional, and like I said, my own biographical history does not match up with Jude's, certain, I guess, tone and things in the book were pulled from my own middle school experience. So I was in 8th grade when 9/11 happened, and I think that was super formative for me because prior to that, I always felt kind of different from my classmates and was asked questions about my background, but they were more kind of from a place of curiosity. And then suddenly after 9/11, everyone was talking about my family's religion and everyone was talking about the region of the world where my family was coming from, and they were not talking about it in positive terms. And I didn't have any other media to counter that. And so I was thinking a lot about that while I wrote Other Words for Home, and how I wanted other young kids of Arab or Middle Eastern descent and other Muslim kids to have a book that I think more accurately represents their cultural heritage than is often seen thus far in books. So with that caveat that there are lots of amazing Muslim writers working right now whose books I'm really excited about. So I'm definitely not in that conversation alone, which I'm happy about. So my agent, she sold the book to my editor in March of 2017, and this gets a little bit weedy. So I already, at this point in my publishing career, Other Words for Home was my 3rd book, and so I already had an agent and I already had an established relationship with my editor. So I feel really lucky that my editor has been my same editor for all of my books. And if there are people in this webinar who are curious about agents or the more nitty-gritty parts of publishing, I would be so happy to answer those questions in the Q&A and get into that more. I just don't want to bore people if the crowd here today is not and more interested in publishing crowd. But so just for the timeline, in March of 2017, the book has sold to HarperCollins Children's Books. It's going to be a book. And I spent most of the summer of 2017 finishing the draft, editing it, going back and forth with my editor. Here's her picture. She'll probably be horrified that I've included her now in my presentation in a picture. But this is Alessandra Balzer, who is my editor. And she is not just a good editor, she's a great editor. I owe a lot to her. She's very, very smart. And we went back and forth on a lot of drafts of Other Words for Home. And it was a solid book. It was getting very close to being complete. But the heart of the book felt wrong to me. And that's a really difficult thing to describe. But as a writer, you just know there's always going to be kind of a gap between what you have in your head and what you're able to get out on the page. And for me, the goal of revisions is to close that gap. But we were, for some reason, for me, the gap just wasn't closing. My editor had done everything she should have. The plot was solid, the character arcs were solid, but just like that heart and that voice, and that's my responsibility. And I felt like that just wasn't right. And then I had this light bulb moment that what wasn't right about it was Jude's voice. And I ended up scrapping the draft and rewriting the whole book in verse, which at first both my agent and editor thought I had lost my mind when I suggested wanting to do this, but they took that leap of faith with me. The book had to be pushed back a couple seasons in its publication date to give me time to rewrite the book, but I'm so glad that I was given that opportunities. I think the book was really better for it. I think it needed to be in verse. And sometimes the odd thing about writing is you have to write the book the wrong way before you figure out how to write it the right way. I get asked a lot about why verse, like how did I know that? And I have that annoying answer. It just like pops into my head, which I know is an annoying answer because all these writers that I admire, I watch their interviews and I want to know, how they came up with the ideas that they did or how they did it, and they'll always be like, it just came to me, and I'm like, that's not helpful, Kate DiCamillo, like help me understand like how exactly you are so brilliant. But this was one of the rare occasions that I've had that really what feels like a light bulb moment of I just heard Jude's voice in my head and kind of in verse form. If I had to analyze it, I would say I think it's because poetry is a huge part of my reading life. I love poetry. I've never considered myself to be a poet, but I love poems. And also the Arabic language is inherently lyrical and the Quran is written in verse. And I think all of those things informed the decision in a way that I didn't quite understand when I had like the grabby, verse sleepy idea light bulb moment of it. So then the book was sent to be put into copy editing, which is publishing speak for basically all of your major changes about the book are done. Copy editing is where someone who's really smart when it comes to grammar and like continue like I guess like linear timeline issues. So like, for example, your copy editor will catch if on page 8 you talk about your character taking off their shoes and then on page 10 they had their shoes back on. So it's almost like done, locked for the most part, besides like spelling and grammar and those types of small changes. So it goes up to copy editing, and then about a year after it goes into copy editing, it is published. And Other Words for Home was published on May 28th, 2019. And it had been a really long journey for the book, as you can see. So that's about 6 years from the idea to being on a shelf, and about, I'd say, 2.5 years of writing and working on it. And for me, most of my books are about 2.5 years of writing. I'm slower than a lot of my friends, but that's just the time that I've learned it really takes me to completely tease out an idea and go through that process. And so I just would end with that books take a long time, but they're worth it. And here are some just fun pictures of the journey Other Words for Home has been on. It's a picture with me with a sign that HarperCollins made for a conference when we could still go to conferences. Picture of me signing books at a school visit, and then a picture of my daughter putting the sticker on the book in January, which is a really sweet and super exciting moment that I'm still incredibly grateful for. So that is kind of my condensed version to take you through kind of the genesis of a book and like how it goes to shelves. And now I thought I could answer some of the questions that had already been sent in, or if any of you have questions right now, I'd be thrilled to answer them. So I'm gonna stop sharing the screen and come back here.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that overview about Other Words for Home. It was really interesting to hear about the inspiration and the process. And I think you answered some of the questions that were submitted. And so I think what we'll do, let's see, there were some questions about the research that you did for the book and what that was like, and whether you did it before writing or during the writing process, and what that looked like for you.
Oh, so that's a great question. So the answer is sort of both, to before and during. So the first thing I did was, like I talked about, I'm very close with the Syrian family. I call him Uncle George, and so is the father of the family. And so I called him and I told him how I wanted to write this book, and I asked him if I could start by interviewing him about his hometown, because I knew that I wanted to base Other Words for Home in this small seaside town, partly because, again, combating this idea that I think oftentimes in America, we only hear about Middle Eastern countries once they're at war, and we see these bombed out photos of cities, and we don't recognize the diversity within the countries. Kids are always so surprised at school visits when I show photos of what this town looks like, this resort town, and even what Aleppo looked like before the Syrian Civil War. And so, but I also wanted to set it in a town that wasn't getting constant news coverage, to also show even children who weren't in the exact kind of zone were super affected, because it would be like, for me living in the Chicago area, if Indiana, erupted in Civil War, that would obviously affect our dynamic and everything. So started with those interviews because I've never been to Syria, and so I've been to Jordan, but it's an entirely different country, and I knew that I really needed to do my research if I was going to set any scenes here and also have an understanding of my characters. And then from there, I interviewed a couple of the cousins who had come over from Syria, and then I interviewed the American cousins about the experience of having their cousins come over and the dynamics at school. And some of them, the younger ones, it was harder to tease out the questions. Some of them were chatty than others. And then, because I didn't want to just have tunnel vision on this one particular family, because I wasn't writing a nonfiction book, I got put into contact through the mosque of other refugees in the area. Again, only concentrating on ones in the Cincinnati area, because for anyone who's interested in writing, there are a lot of, I think, important discussions going on right now about who can tell certain stories. And the thing that I would say is that if you're going to write a story outside of your own breadth of experience, you want to be connected enough to the community that you're writing about to easily, I think, be able to access and talk about them. And the more you narrow that, I think the more likely you are going to be able to do a responsible, authentic job. And so for me, I knew that I really wanted these narrow perimeters on the refugee story that I was telling. And I talked about in the presentation of coming specifically to Cincinnati, already having family in the area, because it's just I just knew that I didn't have enough access or understanding to be able to tell a different migration type of story. So, so I did those interviews, and then as I wrote the book, I would have other questions, and so I would seek out people for interviews. And then at the very end, we had Harper Collins hired different sensitivity readers, because I also recognize this is my own community. So I grew up with this mosque, and even if some of these people aren't my closest family friends, when they read it, they're going to be generous and they're going to like it. And I had also interviewed them. So I wanted to make sure, again, that outside of my own community, but within this, I guess, community, it was going to ring authentic to people. And so we sent it out to get feedback from those 3 years. So it was a long process, but I like to do like research at all stages, I guess. I think that if I do it all up front, I would almost like lose momentum on a project, so I won't know like what I need to know before.
I'm muted. There we go. Thank you. I wanted to talk a little bit. We had some questions about some of the characters in Other Words for Home. So I guess we'll start with Miles, loving the character Miles. And was there ever a real life inspiration for Miles for you, or someone that you knew, or where did the inspiration for that character come from?
Yeah, I feel like Miles is like loosely based on every boy I've ever had a crush on in my life, including like my now husband, which is that I'm always drawn to curious, nerdy boys. I think in general, like all of my crushes on people from friends to romantic tend to fall in that category of people who are interested in things that are bigger than themselves. And I feel like Miles is a character who embodies that, because he is curious about the world at large and has this big heart, and is also imperfect. I mean, like in that scene, he doesn't step up immediately in the moment, but is learning. And I think that was important to me to show that too, that we're not always all perfect, and that doesn't make him a bad kid. It just means that we're all always like growing, and you can have a really big heart and also not exactly know like when the right moment is. And so yeah, he's an amalgamation of all of my middle school crushes and all of my like media middle school crushes. I feel like I always was like into like the nerdy friend who lots of times, like now I know it's like in trend that like actually is the love interest, but I feel like when I was growing up, like they never actually were supposed to be the love interest, but I still like wanted them to be the love interest.
Yeah, I love that scene when Miles doesn't step up. I thought that was such an important thing to include, and really about the relationship between Miles and Jude was really, really great. Another question about the character Sarah, and you mentioned in your presentation earlier about how you were very interested in that relationship between cousins who were born here in the US versus ones who are immigrating from Syria. And so could you talk a little bit more about her character and inspiration and kind of their process with developing her?
Yeah, so Sarah is the character, and I'm always a little bit embarrassed to admit this because she's sort of the antagonist of the book. But I guess in the books that I write, I always feel like there really aren't antagonists. We are just all imperfect people who interact with one another. And so I am definitely the most like Sarah of any of the characters. And I feel like definitely when I was in middle school, I was made to feel very ashamed of my cultural heritage and of my family's religion, and wanted no one at school to know about it. And so if my cousins had come over, I would have been terrible. I would have been horrified, because I would have been like, oh my gosh, this is gonna blow up my like disguises that I think that I built that maybe I haven't built. And so I was really interested in her. I cast her as being like more, I guess, like socially high in the middle school pecking order definitely than I was, just because like in a book, it just works better. It's sort of the dynamics of that worked better. So definitely certain things about her are like fictionalized. It's not like me 100% on the page, but our backgrounds are more similar in terms of being biracial, feeling like you're not enough of either thing, and because of that feeling really lost and lonely. And I have a lot to, I think, say about that. Like I said, initially I thought I would write Sarah's book, and for a while I thought that I was going to do like a companion book to Other Words for Home from Sarah's perspective. But then I started to realize that like I feel like I'm only going to like write one book where the main thing is about being biracial. And if I'm going to do that, I want to be able to have my character go to Jordan, because so much of my feelings about being biracial were born out of my experiences of going back to Jordan almost every summer. And so I'm working now on a middle grade book that's almost like an auto fiction book, where it's set like the summer after 9/11, when the character, who is me but not me, goes back to Jordan. But that like is my Sarah book, which I know isn't, like it's not in the same universe, but I realized because I started working on the Sarah book, and then I was like, I feel limited in this book by the creative universe I wrote for Other Words for Home, which works really well for Jude's story, but doesn't work as well for tackling the question of like that I want to talk about when it comes to being biracial.
Great, thank you. I wanted to talk a little bit about, so one of my favorite things about Other Words for Home is how, like, so all of the sensory detail. And I am curious to know a little bit about if that, because it's all about what she's like smelling and seeing and feeling. There's so much rich detail about that. And I'm curious if that came out more when you decided to switch to writing in verse, or if that was originally part of Jude's voice in the original first draft.
I think both. So I think I'm always toward purple prose type writer. Like and that's the kind of writing I love reading. Like I love really evocative, thick, like you feel like you're sinking into the novel type books. And so a lot of the editing process with my editor, like especially for my next book that's coming out in May, which is in prose, she'd be like, okay, of the 3 metaphors on this page, we get to pick one. You know, so I feel like it's always like really, which to her credit, she's right, because it's like there can be too much. So I think there was a lot of sensory stuff in the prose draft just because I don't know how to write without sensory things, because I don't write books that have lots of plot. So it's more just like how people are feeling and what they're eating. And so, yeah, I definitely had that. But I think that the verse format was able to bring it out in a better way that felt like less forced. I think I really was struggling with having a bit of an imposter syndrome of worrying about being able to capture the voice of someone whose first language is not English. And obviously there's a suspension of disbelief that is going to occur on the part of the reader and the writer because you're reading this book in English. But there are certain like just like tonal patterns and structural patterns to sentences that I notice when I will talk with my cousins and we'll switch between Arabic and English, but just the way they phrase things. And I think I was trying to capture that in the prose draft, and in the verse draft, it was just came alive more to me. It was easier. And I actually think it probably was better to be watered down in that way that we were talking about before. I think in the prose draft, it felt like maybe a little bit oppressive in some of those like sensory details. And it feels more like earned in verse because you're like kind of signed up for that when you're reading a verse novel, I guess.
Awesome, thank you. We have some questions about kind of the writing process, so I think we'll kind of move in that direction a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about how you got started as a writer and what was the process like for publishing your first book and what that all looked like?
Yeah, so I come from a family of storytellers, and I wanted to be a writer for almost as long as I can remember. I distinctly remember having a moment in first grade of making the connection that like there was a name on the front of the book and that person had written the book and that was somebody's job. And then also in first grade, we did this thing called Author's Night where we got to create a book. And I was always a shy kid, but I was exhilarated by getting to go up in the front and like have this audience listen to my story. It was almost like a form of acting. I guess, I don't know. I just loved it. That's probably one of my earliest childhood memories. And I also remember driving home in the car and announcing to my parents that I was going to be a writer, and my dad quickly turning around and being like, no, absolutely not. And not at all because he doesn't love me or doesn't want me to be happy, but that was just not a dream that he even knew to dream. Like he really, you don't move across the ocean because things have gone particularly well for you in your home country. It's like a big risk. And he wanted like stability for my brother and me. And for him, the dream was that we were going to be doctors here in America, and I could pick what kind of doctor I wanted to be. And so I remember like in fifth grade when we did career day, I wore like a white doctor lab coat, but also had a notebook. I was like, I'm gonna be a doctor and a writer. And then I went to college, and I took, like, after undergrad, took time off. I was working as a 6th grade teacher, and I told my parents that I was like taking time to like get my stuff in order for medical school. And while teaching kids, I remembered how much like I had loved books when I was that age, and also was interested in like their reaction to the books. And I started trying to write towards publication seriously then. And most of the books that I was writing were middle grade books, and they were actually kind of like whimsical middle grade books. They were like kind of bad knockoffs of like classic children's books that I had loved when I was a kid. And then I had a really kind of upsetting situation where I unexpectedly lost one of my best friends. And my first book, which is a young adult book, was born out of that experience. And I wrote the book really fast and ended up finding an agent for it really fast, which makes it sound like a publishing fairy tale, but you have to remember like the half-completed multiple attempts at middle grade novels that didn't like go anywhere. And at the time that I was trying to find an agent for this book, it was like the height of John Green mania, and so much stuff I'm publishing is all just about luck and timing. And my book was nothing like John Green, but it was like contemporary with like dark like themes, I guess. Like it was enough that like publishing was like, yeah, like we'll order 10 of those because like, you know, everyone's just trying to find something that will work in the way like The Fault in Our Stars worked. And so I was so grateful, like that they want to publish the book, so excited. And then they gave me this like second book, but I didn't have a second book, and I definitely didn't have a second young adult book. So my second book was like a massive struggle because they thought they'd signed up for like another book like my first book, but without understanding like that book was like a one-off that was born very much out of this particular life experience. And so I was so excited when I was able to sell Other Words for Home and move back into the middle grade space, because I think that's always where I had envisioned myself as a writer. I love a lot of young adult books, and that's not to say that I wouldn't write for that age group again, but my like sweet spot I feel like is like tweens, like the like 11 to 13 age range. So now that I have super young kids, I'm like more and more interested in like even like younger middle grade, just because that's like just so like sweet and tender, and would be interesting to try. But I feel like most of the stuff that I do is sort of like junior high drama, which is a little bit different than teen drama, but is like a category in itself.
Great. Do you ever have trouble focusing on just one writing project? Or do you have multiple projects going on at a time? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so this is my biggest problem as a writer. Still my biggest problem is that I'm an idea hopper. And I'm an idea hopper because middles of books are really hard. And so when you reach the middle and the idea doesn't seem exciting anymore, and you see everything that's wrong with the idea, then you get a shiny new idea, and you don't think that that idea is also going to be terrible once you reach the middle. And so for so long, like we talked about before I finished my first, what would become my first book, I was like writing 50 to 100 pages of books. Again, they weren't great. I don't think even if I had finished them, they were going to be published, but I think there's something you learn as a writer from finishing. And I will still do that today with like ideas, but I've gotten better. And I think partly because I now have the luxury of like this being my job. And so lots of times, like if I sell them an idea, like I have to finish it, which like sounds terrible to be like, I'm finishing it because I'm legally obligated to finish it. But there's something like good about that constraint for me, because I definitely struggle. And I have so much angst about like, did I pick the right idea? If I had picked this other idea, would I, you know, have so-and-so's success that I'm seeing them, you always are like wondering about your idea. And I think the hardest thing for me is learning that you are the kind of writer that you are. You're not necessarily the kind of writer that you want to be, which maybe sounds weird, but like for me, some of my favorite writers have really like classic styles, and their stories feel really timeless. And I feel like the stories that I'm drawn to writing are like more grittier, and they deal more with social justice issues, and they're just different. And I think for a long time I was trying to make myself be this one kind of writer, also because that was the only kind of writer I'd really been like exposed to see. And I think that not that I don't idea hop, but if you're listening to this and you're struggling with that, I think that you will maybe stop idea hopping more when you stop fighting like the type of writer that you are. Because for me, a lot of it will be like, oh, I should write like a really classic dog book because I loved those as a kid and I love them. But I'm not necessarily well suited to that. That's not necessarily the story that I have to tell. And then of course there's the thing of like, I never saw the type of story that I have to tell in books, and it's hard to be something you don't see. And so I think I idea hopped a lot because I thought nobody would want the kind of story I felt like I knew how to tell. So there's a lot, but if it's comforting to whoever asked that question, almost every single writer I know has an idea hopping problem. I think it's like just part of being a writer. And one just practical tip to leave you with would be, I learned this from a friend, that I now have a journal where I just write ideas, and if I can write it down, it feels like I've like harnessed it in a way, like I'll see. And that's what I was talking about with the marinating. Like I've gotten better at letting my ideas live in my head, and instead of immediately trying to write it instead of whatever I'm supposed to be working
on. Thanks. Let's see, we have some more questions in the chat here. Let's see. Someone's asking, do you follow a tight schedule, or do you just write when you feel like writing? Do you set up deadlines? How do you kind of organize your writing process?
Okay, so I'm going to answer for like non-coronavirus times and coronavirus times because they're a little bit different. So, and it's changed for me because while becoming like a published writer, I had children, and children take up a lot of time. Who knew? And energy. But now, like, so in the midst, in other words, we're home with my second child when she was a baby in a sling, like writing, because when they were really little, they were home with me, and I would work like when they napped or didn't nap, and that was very chaotic couple of years. And now they're old enough that in non-coronavirus times, they go to preschool in the morning. And so most of my schedule is built around that. So we wake up together, all of us, and then non-coronavirus times, my husband gets on the train to go to work. I drop the kids off at preschool. I write in the morning. I go and I pick them up. I put them down for nap. I say a prayer that they actually nap. If they actually nap, I do like the business, that sounds so weird, but business part of my job, which is like answering emails or, answering emails, answering notes that I might have gotten from kids, all that kind of stuff. And then in the afternoon, I look for fairies with them in my backyard, and then repeat. So most of my writing is done in the morning, and actually having that consolidated time is usually good for me because I feel like when I had tons of time when I first sold my first book and left my job as a paralegal, I like squandered a lot of time because there's only so much time you can like write. But now it's like around that, and now it's just like really chaotic because they're home all the time. And so I write when I can even let them watch like lots of episodes of Jamie Tiger. So I don't, it's not that helpful, but it's kind of like where we're at right now. But ideally, I write in the morning. I've always been a morning writer, and then I work my schedule around that. I mean, obviously, if I'm on deadlines, I think asked about deadlines. The deadlines usually for me are set by my publisher, and so as long as I don't massively procrastinate, I'm able to make it in that time. But there's definitely times where it's like, once my kids go to bed, I'm working again to just try to get the book ready to go off. But that's usually just a couple of weeks a year when the deadline gets really tight.
And kind of on the same theme, do you ever have days where you don't feel like writing? And if so, how do you kind of cope or deal with those days or feelings? Do you push through them? Do you take a day off? How does that work?
Oh, 100%. And so I should have clarified that when I was doing my schedule. That's when I'm actively involved in a book. I'm definitely not a write every day person, which is not to say there's anything wrong with people where that works for them. But I'm definitely someone who again, I have to marry the idea. It has to be I'm fully committed. And then once I'm in it, in that drafting process, that's when I'm the happiest, because I am working and I feel good about how I'm spending my time. But as I get older, I've been trying to be more gentle with myself, that spending that morning reading, spending that morning walking the dog and observing the world and thinking about the idea or trying to come up with the idea are all a part of the work. I think that it's really important to nurture your psychic space as a writer. And for me, that's born out of my reading life is the biggest way I refill that well. But it's also just being a person and observing other people and thinking about the world and living. And so, well, it definitely doesn't feel as good to feel like I paid other people to watch my kids for me to walk around the park listening to music, trying to feel the idea as it does on the days that I write a full chapter during that time. Those days definitely happen. In terms of writer's block, that's what they were getting at. That will happen to me too, obviously in the middle of drafts, but my biggest advice is that it's always something where I've taken a wrong turn in the book. So what I do is I step away, I take a few days off to refresh my mind, and then I reread everything I've written, and I find the place in the book where I feel like I could write something again. And sometimes that means I lose 20 pages, sometimes I lose 40 pages, sometimes I lose 100 pages, but it's wherever I diverged from losing that thread, and that oftentimes helps.
More questions about writing. Do you think or find value in writing even when it's not going to be published or you don't get published?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I am a writer before I'm an author. I think I'm luckily an author, and I feel so grateful to have an audience and to get to connect with young readers. But I would write even if even if it wasn't getting published, because it's how I make sense of the world. I think it's how I categorize my ideas. And there are definitely things that I write just for me. I write a lot of poems that are just for me. I'm not particularly interested in being a published poet. I don't think necessarily that those poems should be published. So I just want to be careful. I'm not saying I'm sitting on this collection of amazing poems that I'm not sharing, but I also think there's so much value in having creative things that are just for you. It's why I like to have other creative outlets like drawing and things that I'm not at all a professional at, but I like to do just because I think there's value in being creative. And I think that sometimes as a society, we've removed ourselves from that play aspect that children so inherently know how to do. And we lose that as adults, but it's so important and it enriches all of us. I think it makes us happier, it makes us calmer. And so I definitely do that. And I get rejected all the time now, even as a person they've said yes a couple of times. They say no all the time too. So I'll write things and I'll be like, do you want to publish this? And they'll be like, no. And so I will have written those books and now they're just for me. I tell my kids a lot of stories at night. Obviously we read a lot of books that other people have written, but I'll make up stories that definitely don't at all hit the beats that publishing would want them to hit, but they're just fun oral threads. So I'll sometimes work on those so that I have something to say at that time about what happened to Chester the mouse when I create these convoluted stories that I'm telling them. So yes, I think there's so much value in if you write, you're a writer. I want everyone here to understand that. I always see people use the term aspiring writer. You're not an aspiring writer if you write. and so many, publishing is just such a weird game. So if that's like what your end goal is, just keep trying, because like I said, I got very lucky with the John Green mania, but you'll hit that zeitgeist at some moment. It'll happen for you. I know it will. So.
We're coming into the last few minutes here. We had a couple more questions kind of about the future, about what, I know you mentioned a little bit about what you are working on, but also had a question about, for those who don't know, you are a Newbery Honor winner. And so someone had a question about how your writing and publishing kind of life has changed, if at all, since then, maybe what that experience was like. And also if you want to talk a little bit more about the project that you're working on, if you can.
Yeah. So that experience was wild. I can hardly talk about it without like tearing up still. I can't believe that it happened. I will always say that to me, like I so remember the Newbery means so much to me because it's the only award that I knew what it was when I was a kid. Like I remember running my fingers over those stickers. To me, it's also like such an American award, and so to think of that sticker on Jude's story, like saying like something like bigger than me than like the career stuff, which is obviously a gift because that's like just gives you a little bit more like runway to be able to take risks. Like I think that part of the reason that Harper may sign off on this auto fiction novel thing that I'm trying to pitch to them is because of that, because it affords you an ability to be a little bit more bold and experimental. And I want to take that gift and do that because I think that I've seen other people take that gift and do that, and it's helped me because for example, like Jason Reynolds, I feel like always does something new, and when he does it and it's successful, it opens the door for other people to be able to do like a linked short story collection or even a verse novel. I feel like the success of Long Way Down really helped them to be more into that. So all those kind of things, it gives you an ability to push the envelope more, and I'm excited to do that for as long as they'll let me. And then if it's changed things, I feel so glad. So my next book comes out next May, and it's not that a fiction novel. It's a totally different book. It's called The Shape of Thunder, and it's about two girls, middle school girls. They're both starting 7th grade, but a school shooting has happened a year earlier at the high school in their small town, and it's about like, the trauma of mass gun violence and how it affects these communities in ways we don't see after the cameras leave. And both of the girls are have been on opposite ends of the tragedy in a way, and their friendship is fractured because of it. And the book is kind of my homage to Bridget Terabitha because it's about like making a safe space and a space where you feel in control, where places that you should feel safe no longer do. But luckily, most of the book was like written around the time the announcement came out, because I think that it can be hard to write after something like that happens, because again, you feel like you want to prove the committee right, because in some ways I feel like it's like an award, but it's also a like, we're excited about your career, we're excited about what comes next. And so I now want to write a good book for them because they changed my life. And so I definitely I think edited it with more anxiety than I've ever edited something before. But I also like that it's such a different book from Other Words for Home, because it doesn't invite that direct comparison, I hope, because that's also hard. And I know from my favorite authors, when I'll super love a book, it's harder to distance from that. So but yeah, so that comes out in May, and I'm really, really excited about it. It's the hardest book that I've ever written, because it's 2 perspectives. I've never tried that before. It's back to prose, and it was just I think that I'm always interested in how these tough topics that I feel lots of times are really covered in YA, but not covered in middle school. But our kids, they do the shooting drills. Like this is they know this, and I feel like they should be afforded the opportunity to talk about it and talk about the way that it makes them feel. And so the book is not a book that's like prescriptive or has answers. It's more like, this is a thing that's happening in our country, and I wanted to write the book to hold space for kids to be able to say how it makes them feel that this is happening in our country, and just like start that conversation. Because I feel like all of my favorite books as a kid didn't tell me like what I should think about something. They just gave me the place to grapple with it and explore that. So I think that answered those questions. Sorry, it's like all over the place in that answer. But.
No, that's okay. I kind of threw a whole bunch of questions right at you at the end there as we're kind of coming to the last few minutes. And if anyone has any last quick questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, but we are getting to the end here. We put, so at the end of Other Words for Home, Jasmine has included some links to information about the crisis in Syria and about refugee crisis. So we've included those in the chat for you, and you can always save the chat if you would like to save those links after the end of this webinar. But thank you so much, Jasmine. It was so wonderful to get to talk with you about your books and your writing process. And we just really appreciate you coming to speak to our readers here at Sno-Isle. And I'm so excited for your next few books and projects. They sound amazing. So yes, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming today. And I hope everyone has a great, wonderful rest of their day. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.